In recent years, we've seen a major rise in remasters, and in about the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen a surge in remakes. For those unaware of the difference, a remaster usually entails a upscaled resolution, better frame rates, and some quality of life overhauls. Think of your favorite HD remaster for your PS2 game. Whereas a remake is a top-down reimagining of the game. The easiest examples to point to here are Final Fantasy VII Remake and Resident Evil 2's remake. Characters, location, and story elements remain intact, but the gameplay mechanics and systems are entirely reworked, providing a complete reimagining of what the game is. To me, the Dead Space remake feels like a different, non-conventional remake compared to many others I've just mentioned. The refinements made in Dead Space Remake aren't made through reshaping the foundations of its 2008 predecessor, but instead building on the source material, building on astonishing atmosphere, environments, combat, and enemies' unpredictability. It strikes this great balance between what it changes and the aspects of the game that it keeps in place. Dead Space Remake was taken on by Studio Motive, who are best known for their work on Star Wars Squadrons and supporting DICE through Star Wars Battlefront 2. In short, the Dead Space remake didn't disappoint, not in the slightest. Overall, they have taken a game that was already a juggernaut of the horror genre and made it a must-play, a definitive experience for newcomers and veterans. It feels like for both those who are experienced and inexperienced with the horrors of the Ishimura, like you are stepping on it for the first time. The story for Dead Space Remake follows Isaac Clarke on a rescue mission to find his girlfriend Nicole. He is accompanied by Kendra Daniels and Zach Hammond, who are on a mission to inspect the Ishimura and the recent happenings that have been reported. The story doesn't diverge from its 2008 counterpart, but it does lend itself to adding some more lore through logs that would be explored in later games. Dead Space's narrative was something that I always found enthralling, and replaying the remake was such a treat to re-experience. Despite knowing many of the twists and turns and how the game would unfold, the remake manages to provide a fresh take on the story that's worth experiencing again, especially if you haven't played this game in years. It'll be a fresh and slick trip down memory lane. I'll refrain from talking too much about the narrative, as I do feel like this is one that you should just play and experience for yourself. But in short, if you are a newcomer and are curious about the Dead Space series and wondering if this game is worth playing for the story alone, you'll more than likely be satisfied with the game's narrative, so I would lean more towards a yes. The combat in Dead Space was always something that I've admired, even back when I played the original. The limb dismantling combat always felt like a great subversion to what we've gotten used to with aiming for headshots to kill enemies. It provides you with a way to think outside the box and consider which weapons you equip to deal with which enemies, but it also works cleverly with the different kinds of enemies that you'll face throughout this game and trying to carry the correct tools and weapons for those particular weak spots. All of these types of mechanics are still in place and work fantastically in the remake. One side note I've always found really cool in Dead Space, speaking of tools, is the practicality of the weapons that are also tools. It makes a lot of sense given that Isaac is an engineer and these weapons are tools of his trade. It's a clever little cohesive element that I've always found fascinating and thought was pretty cool. Anyways, back to the important stuff. The gameplay here is still intact, feeling fresh and familiar to those who have played the original. I found some weapons more useful this time around playing the game, and the weapons that you pick up throughout the game are more extensive than they were in the original. Where in the original, each weapon would have one particular function on top of their primary shooting function, in the remake your weapon has many different unlockable abilities, which are unlocked through the workbench. Workbenches are your stop-off point for those new to Dead Space, and it is at the workbench where you'll upgrade your weapons with nodes found throughout the Ishimura. There are about 3 different abilities that are unlockable for each weapon. For those returning players, you'll be happy to know that in the Dead Space remake, every node on a weapon or equipment rewards you with something. There is no empty nodes like in the original, and to me, that's a much welcomed improvement. With the brilliant environmental design, coupled with the versatile set of weapons, making each room a puzzle to solve, once you get your hands on stasis and kinetic abilities, you'll start to really see the whole entire gameplay loop of Dead Space really start to flourish. The abilities that you can hurl with kinetic abilities, from explosives to pinning enemies to the floor with pipes, or freezing your enemies to get some distance between them using stasis. Every bout with the Necromorphs as you progress through this game is as empowering as it is frightening. The more and more you progress, the more and more options become available, and the more fleshed out your choices become. but the game never makes you feel too overpowered, with a wide range of enemies that continuously keep you on your feet, areas to explore, and real approach to intensity. All these things that we'll get to real soon. The next significant change is to the environments. Where the original captured the hopeless, tense feeling of the Ishimura from the disfigured bodies, the flickering lights, and the rattling sound in the vents, the writing was on the wall, quite literally. This place was in ruin. One welcomed addition that can be found in the remake is its approach to lighting that Motive has incorporated. Some areas will oscillate between being well lit to borderline pitch black. The continuous flickering of lights, dim-lit halls, only heightens the frantic panic of determining where each necromorph is coming from. Both your eyes and ears are working overtime as you panic your way through each of these claustrophobic halls, waiting for an enemy to jump you, and praying that you make it from one end of the room to the next, hopping door to door, praying that it won't be your last. But on top of that, there is also a new feature that can be found in the Dead Space Remake to elevate the environments, and that is how in specific environments you will find yourself at a generator. These generators will be running with power, having different streams that are highlighted red and blue for off and on. And what you'll notice at these generators is that certain generators will come with a trade-off. Let's say lighting for access to an elevator, and the player will have to make these trade-offs, sacrificing vision and or a lack of vision to get to the next point in the level. These kinds of additions in the Dead Space Remake add an additional layer of fear and immersion to the experience. They make areas that were once maybe not as dark feel a lot more intense, and the Ishimura is already a labyrinth to traverse with vision. Imagine the pitch black halls with only your torchlight when you're aiming down sights. This narrow vision and roars and rattles echoing around you. If there is one major takeaway from the remake, it is how well they have managed to nail the atmosphere, and that is no easy feat. One of the big monumental changes, I would say, in the Dead Space remake is how they have reworked zero gravity sections. Where the original Dead Space had the zero G segments that would be a lot more on rails, having the player super glued to the floor, only allowing them to jump between different set pieces, the remake completely reshapes this, having these moments allow the player to jet around, shoot, and spin. It really is a reimagining in a lot of ways of these segments, and it really does refine something that I think would feel very dated in 2023. The objectives and foundations are still the same and remain intact from the original, but it has been altered and modernized to make what would otherwise be one of the more dated parts of the game feel authentic, polished, and fresh. It also means that segments like the torrent sequences, which many weren't a fan of, have seen a rework and are a lot more easier to navigate this time around, where you essentially will go up and click an interactable little HUD and it will let you shoot the meteors and fly around while doing so, avoiding being hit by them. I still do think it's a tad awkward navigating around these areas in Zero G, and particularly these segments where you have things being hurled at you, as movement can be a bit awkward. But I don't think that it's anything too crazy or worth complaining about to a large degree. I do think that it's a major uplift from what the original had for these segments, and I do think that it takes some of the lowest points of Dead Space 1 and makes them a lot more palatable. Throughout your experience with the Dead Space remake, you'll notice how unscripted and unpredictable a Necromorph encounter will be. It will feel like one moment a room may be safe, but in an instant can be swarming with enemies. This feeling and uncertainty are due to what Motive calls the intensity director. These encounters work by gauging and tracking the player as they move through each room. It will analyze how long it has or hasn't been since an enemy encounter, making a generated decision that will manifest in different ways to provide the player with a scare. It's designed to catch you off guard, essentially. But even with this knowledge in mind and understanding how this mechanic works, its unpredictability will always keep you on the edge of your seat. It's one of the elements that makes re-exploring old areas of the Ishimura so uneasy and unsettling, especially given the finite amount of resources that you will have throughout your travels. If there is one thing that really hits home the incredible amount of detail and immersion in Dead Space, it's the environments and its attempts at level design, and it would be how it shines through in many of the different locations found aboard the Ishimura. Many of these areas will have insane ramblings on the wall, a vacant and unsettling emptiness. The The areas and environmental storytelling of Dead Space are in many ways what makes this horror experience so memorable and iconic. As you tread through the halls of this ship that has been tormented, you will see many different stories unfold before your eyes. There is a lot of great work that has been done through text and audio logs in this game to paint a picture of what transpired, but nothing can quite convey it as well as just taking in the environment around you. It's as the saying goes, a picture can paint 1,000 words, and here with Dead Space, they've painted enough words to fill up a book. The level of imagery and storytelling here that conveys the downfall of Ishimura and its occupants is brilliantly conveyed, and the remake only takes steps to further enhance that level of brilliance that the original established all those years ago. One of the great new additions that can be found in the Dead Space remake is the ability to traverse back and forth between levels. Where in the original, the game would have you loop back around through these different areas through the use of loading screens, the remake is a seamless driver using the tram to traverse you through multiple different stopping points. With that being said, with broader horizons comes more rooms locked behind passes to explore. You'll acquire these passes through the story and also side content. And oh yeah, there's side quests now. The Dead Space remake provides a handful of side quests that share insight with the player into the events that have unfolded among the Ishimura, and some other things as well that I don't want to spoil. But overall, this experience of going back and looking through rooms that were previously locked, acquiring new passes, it provides an added layer and a reason to go back and double check, especially in a survival horror game when you're always looking for the next upgrade and resources to make your frightful, nightmarish journey that much more easier to navigate. There's nothing quite as satisfying as getting kitted out with new upgrades and weapons that make the whole experience just that much more fun and creative to play with. The enemies in Dead Space, oh man, I've forgotten how many different types of them there were. The different abilities and attacks that these enemies, the Necromorphs, have presented always kept the game surprising. Almost all of the enemies in this game are fun and always manage to catch you off guard if you're unprepared. It was a great visual indicator when attacking these enemies. You'd see, like for example, the force gun propelling enemies back and in the process blowing off their flesh. Like, it's insane. It is another little detail that just adds that much more character to the experience. But the way you just mince up the Necromorphs really does finesse the visual spectacle and the gorish grit, providing a glow up players of the original didn't know they needed, but would welcome. The range of enemies in this game is still impressive, and how well most of them work within the game is also quite a feat. From the projectile shooting lurkers to the towering brutes and the iconic slashers, let's not forget. A few enemies can provide a minor annoyance, such as the Guardian Necromorphs, who are the ones that are like glued to the wall and like shoot those little sack-like monstrosities, but they are still manageable and not a hindrance to the overall experience. They're few and far in between as well, but they are still just as much of a pain as I remember them being when I played the original. With that being said, like the visual designs of all of the Necromorphs are so distinct and memorable as well that you are so easily able to identify which one is which once you are familiar with a particular Necromorph. And on the topic of the visuals, let's just get into how breathtaking and stunning the visual design and sound presentation for this game is. The visual presentation in the Dead Space remake is one of the highlights that really sells the experience. As mentioned before, the lighting and lack of in particular areas throughout this remake really do elevate the level of stress and intensity, something that was felt to be mastered in the original and has somehow been outshined in this game. Many areas in the game really do elevate that level of stress and anxiety, treading down the narrow corridors with the fear that an enemy can drop down or pop out the vents or anywhere around you, given the randomized system that is in place. But that isn't to discredit how beautiful these levels actually look and how many different vents and shafts and narrow dim lights that project and create a sense of unease as you tread through them are available within this game. And on top of that, each location is so distinct and visually succinct. From the futuristic techie looking hangars, to the empty and vacant hospital that is the medical ward, to the feeling of the overgrown areas of the hydroponics room. And by overgrown, I mean overgrown with necromorphs. But every area in this game is just so well designed and looks so stunning, and you just really want to stop and take it in sometimes, just how great the Ishimura is to explore. And it's not just because of how well the level design of traversal is made, but also through the use of how visually stunning it all is to just take in. It really is crazy to think I've played this game once, because it feels like a complete new experience in a lot of ways. This vivid image of a dimly lit hall is only matched by how stellar the audio design in this game is. As I previously mentioned, the rattling, the screams, and the roars, the sounds of flickering, the music building up and building in and growing ever tenser as if to indicate something is there, an enemy, but sometimes it fizzles away to trick you as if to make you think you're all good and to lay back with ease. The sounds of all your weapons smacking and shooting the enemies, the feeling of the haptic feedback of the DualSense controller give you this particular sort of weight to your shots and attacks. Speaking of weighty attacks, the stomping of an enemy for the sheer life is scary, but man, what really seals the deal here is the intensity and the frantic grunts of Isaac as he tries to sequentially stomp each enemy, and as each stomp progresses, it gets more and more chaotic. It provides you with panic and urgency as a player, as you wishfully pray that you don't see those deformed claws spring up and attack you. The sound and visual presentation is really what creates Dead Space into being one of those games that is just super atmospheric, super memorable as a horror game. It's what sells and captures that horror feeling and really defines it and enshrines it as a top tier game in the genre. So to bring this all together, I believe Dead Space Remake is a phenomenal game that builds upon and adds many features to an already incredible experience. It takes the Dead Space we know and love and provides a fresh experience for veterans and a definitive experience for newcomers. It improves areas that would feel old and dated in 2023, but maintains many of the pillars that make Dead Space a thrilling nightmare that it is. Motive has done a fantastic job here, and I would love to see them take on the following two entries in the series. The Dead Space series has been sorely missed, and many who felt disappointed by the Callisto Protocol, expecting a game like Dead Space, will surprisingly find a fresh take on the Dead Space formula here with the Dead Space Remake. This game is brimming with new ideas wrapped in a classic we know and love. I really do hope that EA greenlight the complete revival of Dead Space, and that we see more of the nightmarish adventures of Isaac Clarke. With the return of the survival horror genre with more Resident Evil games, particularly the remakes, I wouldn't be surprised if fans would be more than excited to just see Dead Space just come back in full force. And I think we will, especially with how good this remake is, see more of this in the future. At least I'm praying. Anyways, that's it for this video, and I hope you have enjoyed it. And if you made it this far, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. Have a good one, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching.